Hi, and good morning. Welcome to today's session. Today's presentation will be about spatial organization and land use patterns. I'd like to first thank you for your interest in this session, and I hope that the circumstances are different next year, that we can be together for the conference. With that said, I'm thrilled and excited to have the chance to introduce you to the topics that we're going to discuss today. I'd like to thank the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and the National Tribal Land Association for this opportunity. So I hope that you all will ask questions after the live stream of this presentation and also visit Renewal's virtual booth at some point during the conference. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Amy Wilson. I'm the owner and primary consultant at Renewal. I started Renewal in the summer of 2019. Renewal stands for Social, Economic, Energy, and Resource Renewal. We're a multidisciplinary firm located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We work nationwide. We specialize in government, community, and economic development and land use. We work with tribal nations and private sector and intermediary organizations on a variety of projects that involve tribal economies, on-reservation communities, land and energy development. I personally have 10 years of experience in the public and private sectors, working on energy development projects, doing land use planning, and working in projects that involve tribal economies and land development. Immediately prior to starting Renewal, I spent 5 years working for the Office of Indian Energy and Economic Development. IED is positioned under the Department of the Interior, Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs. During my time with IED, I worked directly with tribes on a range of issues involving Indian lands, economic and energy development. I led projects involving land use planning, land trespass, tribal utility projects, and a range of energy planning projects. I also provided technical assistance to federal agencies and offices that were responsible for managing trust lands, provided agency oversight and compliance assistance. My education includes a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Colorado. I have a master's degree in energy and resources law from the Stern College of Law at the University of Denver. I also have a bachelor's in sociology from the University of Colorado and an associate's degree from San Juan College in Farmington, New Mexico. And I hold a national certification in public management. So my background is primarily in Indian lands and working with tribal nations, doing land development and energy development. So I'm really excited again to be presenting at this conference and having the opportunity to discuss today's topic. So again, today's topic is spatial organization and land use patterns. The purpose of the session is to encourage you to think about lands as being spatially organized into social, economic, and natural systems. Through the course of this presentation, we'll build on a framework that can be used to evaluate the factors that influence land use patterns over time. We'll be able to compare tools that we can use to evaluate more desirable conditions in the future. As we go through the presentation today, you'll notice that the topic directly relates to this year's conference theme. As a reminder, this year's conference theme is reflecting on the past in order to reimagine the future. Reflecting on spatial organization of lands within your jurisdiction and understanding the factors that influence land use patterns is a tool to help you do just this, to help you reflect on the past in order to reimagine the future. Reflecting on the past really allows us to take an honest inventory of the current conditions, to assess where we're at, what got us here, and to help us identify tools that we can use to create more optimal circumstances in the future. Optimal use of lands is essential for being good stewards of the land and benefiting from our resources to the fullest extent possible, not being wasteful, protecting public health and safety, and creating an economic environment where you have competitive advantage, where you make the rules. As tribal leaders and decision makers, land managers and land staff, you have a role in land use. You have a role in how land use patterns emerge over time within your jurisdiction. I don't have to tell you that the topic of land use within Indian country is highly complex. Land rights and ownership are a fundamental concept or component to development. When working in Indian country, oftentimes you're working in multi-jurisdictional environments where there's overlapping and often conflicting rules. As tribes, you're constantly trying to defend your authorities over your lands within your nation, including the rights to manage or have land use management authorities over fee lands within the exterior boundaries of your nation. Housing and infrastructure is a huge challenge in many cases. You're dealing with a complex economic environment and sovereignty that many outside of Indian country just really don't understand and sometimes don't respect. So I'm hoping that this presentation will encourage you to engage in thoughtful evaluations of the lands within your nation, both on your own time, but also with your colleagues and even with family members, elders, and youth. Discuss their perspectives of the lands within your nation, how they interact with the environment around them, and the social and economic and natural systems, and what their perception of that is. So you can better understand land organization within their perspective. My goal at the end of this session is that you'll have a framework to assess land use. And you'll have the information needed to evaluate the types of tools that can be used to influence land use patterns. The presentation will be roughly 35 minutes. The first 3 slides will focus on creating a contextual framework. We'll start out simple and then we'll build from there. I'll introduce general terms and concepts relating to spatial organization. And then I'll hit on why spatial organization matters to you. Then we'll move into the concept of spatial analysis. We'll review informal and formal methods of spatial analysis and discuss why spatial analysis is important for understanding our environment. The last part of the presentation is really the meat and the potatoes of the presentation. We'll first discuss informal land uses, what that means, what it looks like, and what the result is. Then we'll discuss tools for land management. We'll look at the relationship between land uses and what that means, what it means to really optimize land use. Finally, we'll get into your role as it relates to land management. We'll discuss how in your role you influence and have an influence over land use within your jurisdiction. So at the end of this presentation, I'll conclude with challenge questions that relate to the topics that I covered today. Spatial organization. Spatial refers to the character of space. It really relates to the shape, size, and position of objects within an area. It describes how objects fit together. The organization component refers to a system of arrangement and order. It's a structure, a way of classifying things. So objects can be placed randomly, they can be intentionally placed, or they're placed in some structured way. So this image is a photo of Metlakatla Indian community on the Annette Islands Reserve in Alaska. You'll notice that there's a lot and block layout. It's these buildings and uses fit together nicely. They're well organized. You can tell it was a well planned out. Spatial organization refers to the spatial arrangement of lands within a defined area. So in this context, spatial arrangement refers to the physical makeup of the natural, built, and social environment around us. When considering land use, spatial refers to human or man-made natural objects within an area, including people themselves. So spatial organization is really concerned with the arrangement of resources, where things are located and positioned, and the proximity between people, places, and things within a defined area. For example, the location and arrangement of land resources, including things such as water and energy supplies, wildlife, infrastructure, natural landmarks, and built areas of human settlement. It's important to understand the relationship among these so we can optimize the land uses. When thinking about how lands are spatially organized, we place a lot of focus on the social elements of a community, including demographics, areas of economy, industry and production, places of worship, ceremonial practice, and recreation. So space can be defined in a variety of ways. It can be defined as a legal, political boundary, such as the exterior boundary of a tribal nation. It can be described as a city, county, village, or state. An imaginary space can be defined by imaginary boundaries. Like, for example, a regional boundary. These are generally agreed upon, but they're not legally or formally established. Just like with tribal traditional lands that may not be included within the reservation. These are traditional lands that aren't defined by a boundary. However, there is a boundary based on your perception of the land and your experiences. So space can be defined by natural and physical boundaries such as rivers and mountain ridges, or built boundaries such as walls and roadways. We typically define a space by the way that the area is utilized. For example, zoning and land classification systems. These help us to define boundaries and separate uses by type, density, and intensity. So it's important to remember that the regional context is incredibly important when you're considering land use and spatial organization of an area. We have these economic, social, and environmental relationships with the neighboring communities and with the larger region and beyond. So optimizing land use within a defined area within our jurisdiction necessitates consideration of lands, humans, and economies outside of our jurisdiction. We need to optimize land based on this defined area. It necessitates considerations of these economies outside of the defined space. So we must look at how those adjacent and regional spaces are organized. This is important for a variety of reasons. It helps us to locate and understand the mobility of people and things, meaning how we move individuals, goods and services, and resources from one place to another. It's important to understand for making the most efficient use of lands and resources. It helps us to reduce the burdens and impacts of infrastructure. It helps us to become more competitively positioned. So considering the regional context, it's also necessary in terms of protecting natural resources within a defined area, both those that are confined to your jurisdiction and those that transverse the boundaries. Spatial organization matters because it allows governments to take advantage of their status and authorities, especially in the case of tribal governments. So understanding spatial organization within an area helps us to understand how residents and non-residents engage in the land and resources within your area. It helps you to understand the relationships between these. Understanding the spatial organization, it helps governments to optimize lands and resources in order to maximize values and benefits, while also protecting public health and safety and promoting well-being. Spatial organization of land uses within a jurisdiction, it matters for things such as energy consumption and availability, infrastructure needs, capital costs and maintenance required to grow those infrastructure and utility systems so you can grow. And it also helps us to understand access to housing, education, shopping, recreational spots, cultural areas, and other social gathering spaces. So spatial analysis is defined as a systematic review of the spatial arrangement or organization of an area. Spatial analysis can be based on an informal process or a highly formalized method of analysis. It's about taking an integrated and systematic view of the components within an area so we can better understand that relationship between humans and their environment. Spatial analysis is considered highly personal. It's how we perceive our environment around us, how we interpret that environment. As humans, we're constantly analyzing our surroundings, whether we're actively thinking about it or not. So we analyze our we analyze an area based on how we behave and interact with our environment. The natural, physical, and built social elements of that environment help us to determine how we navigate that space, what influences us, and how we interact with the people, places, and things within that space. As humans, we navigate our environment based on perceived values and the benefits that we gain from our interactions. So you see this image has a steering wheel and Post-it notes all over it. This is likely a mom with all these things to do. She probably has 3 kids in the back seat, and she needs to navigate her environment. She's assessing the environment based on the benefits that are going to be gained from navigating that in the most effective, efficient, and sensible way possible, so she can get everything done, get home, get the kids to bed, and hopefully have time for herself. This is an image of a little girl and probably her grandfather. Maybe the grandfather chose this fishing spot because it's close to home, proximity. In this example, he would be valuing the convenience. Maybe he chose it because the fish are biting. This example, he would choose this spot because he values catching fish. He knows that he has a better chance of catching fish. But maybe he chose this spot not because it's close to home and not because there's fish there or the fish are biting, but maybe because he went there as a child and he has fond memories. He wants to share those memories with his granddaughter. So this is where he's placing value on. He's placing value on his personal experiences, the ties to the land, and the importance of sharing those memories with his granddaughter. This last example is shows 4 men. They're looking over a site plan. So they're going to take a higher level of analysis, a higher method of analysis when they're evaluating the space around them and evaluating the space for this site. They're going to be looking at land status, permitting requirements. They're going to do their due diligence. So they're engaging in this higher level of analysis, a higher level than the grandfather, a higher level than the mom. So the examples illustrated in the previous 2 slides, those describe cognitive mapping and wayfinding. Cognitive mapping and wayfinding are formal concepts that we use to describe informal methods of analysis. Cognitive mapping and cognitive wayfinding are terms that were derived in the study of environmental psychology. Environmental psychology is the study of the relationship between human behavior and our individual experience with the built and natural environment. Environmental psychology is a really fascinating field of study. It emphasizes that the environment and human behavior is holistic. We act as a unit. The environment and human behavior is symbiotic. The relationship between 2 or more organisms where one may or may not benefit from the other. So environmental psychology, it describes an environment where there are multiple stimulus and responses to one individual perception. Cognitive mapping and wayfinding is highly personalized. This is a highly personalized method of analysis. It's an informal method. It's dependent on how the individual stores information and how we categorize things in our heads, which varies from person to person. So such as the mom, she was categorizing, she was deciding how to navigate the lands based on information stored within her head, not from a map. This cognitive map is a mental map or image. It holds some representation of the spatial arrangement of the physical environment. So these are incomplete, highly distorted and simplified personal maps. They're mind maps, maps of recollection and personal experience. So these maps help us to organize places, spatial relations, and distances between places and traveled paths. So we use cognitive wayfinding as a method to navigate our area. We're basing our navigation on these mental maps. Cognitive wayfinding refers to an adaptive function that we use to assist us in moving through the environment. Cognitive wayfinding helps us to locate valuable things such as food and shelter. It helps us to travel from one place to another based on spatial cognition and how we perceive our area around us and how we function within that area. Formal analysis implies some formalized method of review, meaning there's a method or a system of analysis that's done in a methodical way. This is a process that's marked by regularity. It's concerned with the classification of elements within a system. This process is used to classify and describe relationships. Formal methods of analysis include those that are based on formal classification of lands and resources, for example, zoning. Another example is when natural resources are classified into renewable and non-renewable resources. This is a common classification of resources. When we think of trust lands, we think of those lands and resources where the Bureau of Indian Affairs is the lead trust agent. They're largely responsible for many types of leases, including rights of way, timber, grazing, and homesite leases. So we can use this as ways to classify lands and resources. It's a formal method of analysis that we can use. Formal methods of analysis also include formal mapping and navigating tools such as satellite mapping and GIS. These are incredibly powerful tools. They not only allow us to locate resources and capacities and capabilities, but also to understand the relationship between humans and the natural environment. We can access data such as census data that helps us to gain information on demographics, to understand where people are located in relationship to these resources and how they utilize them. This is a formal method of analysis that I'm describing. So informal land uses, or unclassified, unregulated, unenforced land uses, are especially common in Indian country. This is likely a symptom of property rights. Formalized land use is traditionally rooted in the urban economics model, where land use designations are a function of the price of land and the transferable rights or ownership, meaning the ability to freely dispose of and acquire lands. Fundamental to this model is the idea that of land rents or value is determined by land capability and availability. For example, economic geography says that the closer the property is to the center or the core of a community, the more valuable or expensive that land is, because theoretically you're closer to industry, you're closer to jobs and institutions. Now, clearly, trust lands completely messes up this model. It turns it on its head. And to some extent, checkerboard lands further disrupt it. So it's important to remember that informality evolves over time, meaning informal land uses create land use patterns over time, whether they're planned or not. There are underlying factors that influence this, such as property rights, but also settlement patterns, where humans settle and how they interact with their environment. For example, roads. Roads are a huge factor that influence land use within an area. Opening oil and gas or forestry roads, other roads for industry, this opens land for development that otherwise was inaccessible or really hard to access. So now people are starting to locate there, they're starting to settle there, they're using these lands. When this happens, development is likely unplanned and unregulated. So this type of development, it really creates pressure on infrastructure. It creates safety and health hazards because the infrastructure isn't there in order to protect the community. It can impact wildlife and also disrupt vegetation. One of the biggest implications of informal land use is that it weakens the benefit to investment. So why would someone want to invest in land leases or a business if you're unsure of your rights, if you can't enforce your rights and claim benefits to your investment? For example, take an owner of a multi-use site. Say there's a nice hotel and a restaurant and some type of retail store. This is a multi-use site. Imagine that a big standing gravel pit or even a dump site goes in next door. This industrial development, it's incompatible with the multi-use development. for multiple reasons. If unplanned, it's likely that the sand and gravel site or the dump site will compromise existing grading and drainage, meaning that the adjacent site, the multi-use, is going to take on this burden. There'll be an impact on roadways. Also, these are industrial sites. They're eyesores. They're noisy. They're dangerous when located next to other uses. So this negatively impacts the investment made in developing the multi-use site. The industrial activity weakens the value. Without formal land designations, as an investor, you have no recourse of appeal. You have no basis for formal action. There's no way to enforce a violation of land use because there is no formal land use classifications. So this will certainly be a drawback to investment, and it will, at the end of the day, it's going to compromise the local economy. It's going to hurt the local economy because you're going to lose a considerable amount of revenue. The spatial analysis helps us to pinpoint emerging patterns. Land planners and urban designers and policymakers use some variation of the following as a framework for classifying land uses and defining the character of an area. These are formal methods of judging the landscape. Urban form. Urban form refers to the measure of a footprint. It includes site-specific, such as floor-to-area ratio, height, or building setbacks, but it also includes the settlement pattern in general. It's the foundation for what sets that pattern. Think of the image of Metlakatla, that image of the pattern that's set for the outlying areas. Zoning and design standards, these are a framework to assist and facilitate creating a more desired pattern of development. Density refers to the ratio of a population to an area, or by jobs to an area. So if you're looking at population, you're concerned with how many people occupy a certain land space, regardless of the jobs and services and other types of development. If you're looking at density in terms of jobs to an area, this helps you to better understand the employment concentration and mobility. For example, if you have a large population but no jobs, that population is leaving to go to work and they're coming home. So they're using your infrastructure. There's an increased pressure on infrastructure without any gains on your side. You're not gaining any revenue. So your resources are being utilized without compensation. Grain is a term that we use to describe land uses within an area based on land capability and land classification. It refers to the diversity of land uses occurring within an area. For example, is the area mostly residential or mostly commercial uses occurring, or is there agricultural use, or is there a mix of uses? Is there a diverse set of uses occurring? So this is really valuable for understanding the relationship between uses, looking at conflicting and complementary uses. Oftentimes we think of Euclidean zoning, which is a zoning method that classifies and organizes land use by use, density, intensity. So depending on the zoning map, diversity can, the Euclidean map or Euclidean zoning can significantly reduce diversity. For example, where a jurisdiction is zoned as straight residential or straight commercial, there's no diversity in that area. And this is often obviously done on purpose to minimize conflicting land uses. So you don't end up with a gravel pit or a dump site next door to a multi-use site. However, diversity isn't always bad. Diversity can be very good. Complementary land uses are desirable. After all, the goal is to optimize production of land and to maximize the resulting benefits. So you accomplish this through diversifying your land uses that are complementary. So the last one, connectivity. Connectivity refers to modes of circulation for people and goods and the connections being made either directly or indirectly between those. Together, these concepts will really help us to detect patterns in the landscape or the human environment. Whether you have formal zonings and land classification in place or not, you can detect land patterns using these concepts. So it's important to remember that linking data to an area is important. So understanding demographics and economic data for an area helps us to understand those relationships and how land use patterns emerge over time. For example, Rutherford Platt in his book Land Use Controls describes the relationship between humans and the natural environment as overlapping categories of spatial data. He says, number one, these are physical phenomena, the location matters. Number two, human socioeconomic activities occur within this area. And number three, patterns of legal and political authority. These are complex interactions that together produce land use patterns. They're overlapping categories of spatial data. So this understanding is important because it helps us to better understand the relationships, the social patterns, distributions of people, places, and things, so we can better optimize land uses in the future. Optimizing land use is the goal. This is the primary goal. So making efficient and effective use of lands and resources by supporting land uses and maximizing the value and benefits that are derived from those resources. So whether your nation has formal plans and policies in place or not, it's important to evaluate the idea of land optimization based on the values that you perceive and the benefits, the associated benefits. So at CR Renewal, we help to do this. This is kind of our area. We help you to identify ways to optimize land uses that are aligned with your values and what you perceive as benefits from the land. So as leaders and managers, you should be looking at the current organization of land uses. You should be looking at land use patterns within your jurisdiction. Then you consider the tribal vision, the community and tribal goals, and traditional practices and values. You do an inventory of land uses. You assess the associated values and benefits, and you figure out what activities are both aligned with tribal resources, assets, values, and goals, and that will also make the most effective and productive use of lands. So then you want to think about the tools that will help make this happen. If you already have formal planning tools in place, such as land use plans and zoning codes, ask yourself if they're working. And if they're not, ask what sorts of tools, and if you don't have tools, ask yourself what sorts of tools will help you to achieve better land use patterns and optimize those land uses. So I've developed this table to illustrate what I mean by land optimization. Here I've listed land uses: housing and shelter, utilities, landfill, economy, energy, and cultural. So no matter if you have formal land classifications or not, these uses are occurring within your nation. So associated with those land uses is a perceived value or benefit. Remember, we use lands and resources based on how we perceive the lands and the benefits and values that we derive from those lands. So optimizing land use means optimizing those uses, being able to identify and include land uses that complement each other, where you can achieve multiple things at the same time with the same land. So with housing and shelter, you're gaining social, economic, and cultural values. This proper housing protects health and welfare. It really provides options. I hear all the time that people say, oh, I really love to live at home, but there's no housing, so I have to go off the reservation. And guess what? Once they're established outside the nation, they're probably not coming back as much as they want to. So that really compromises your core, your social fabric. Utilities are another value for economic values and purposes of that, but the benefit is that it allows for growth. It protects public health, safety, and welfare. Likewise with energy, these are sources of revenue, but they also will protect your people. Having consistent source of energy, reliable and affordable, this is important for your community. And cultural land uses are also important for the public community fabric. So in tribal nations, benefits, if you're optimizing land the biggest benefit is it protects sovereignty. It really helps you to use your authorities to the fullest extent possible and to maximize those uses and optimize land use. It protects sovereignty by doing this. So formal land use plans and practices such as implementing policies, they help to improve security of investment. They're tools that can be used to accommodate social needs, such as housing and public services. We use them to attract sound development and to justify funding requests, and also to prove that development is worth the investment. Formal land use plans require strong leaders and land managers to implement and enforce policies and development standards and plans. So remembering that just having a shiny land use plan or a zoning code in place, it isn't enough. In order for it to really work, these tools must be tailored to your needs. These must be tailored to the community and the circumstances. And the individuals who are charged with implementing them must understand the role of the plan and the policy, must have the resources and capacity and desire to implement and enforce these plans. So if you don't have those, the plans and policies are worthless. At Renewal, this is what we do. We really work to tailor plans and policies to your community, your circumstances. These are not situations of one size fits all. One size fits all doesn't work generally, and it sure doesn't work in Indian country. So the challenge I have for you today is to think about your role. Think about the role of tribal government and how in your role you have the ability to influence land use patterns. So tribal government, it's a legal organization that works under a tribal constitution. Leadership works under that umbrella, working to forward the purpose of the tribe. As leaders, you're responsible for planning and policy making and enforcing rules. Land managers and land staff, working under tribal departments and programs, you're responsible for administering lands and resources. You're responsible for making recommendations, creating options and choices for leaders to consider. You're really the experts on the ground. Your role is to inform decision makers and implement plans and policies. So you're likely documenting activities to show that you're following plans and policies and procedures. You're collecting data to measure whether or not goals that are outlined in those plans are being met. And when they're not being met, you're figuring out why, and you're making recommendations to council and leadership so you can recalibrate, get back on track and aligned with those goals. So my challenge for you is to really think about your role in your relationship to land development. Think about spatial organization and land use patterns and how those emerge over time. So I have 4 questions here. Do present land use patterns reflect your nation's values and goals? Number 2, can you pinpoint the emergence of land use patterns within your nation? Number 3, consider the benefits and drawbacks to formal planning and land controls. What will work for you? Number 4, to the extent that the nation has formal planning tools in place, consider if they're working or not. Are they tailored to your needs? Or are they being implemented? By doing this, you're reflecting on the past in order to reimagine the future. You're taking time to contemplate the spatial organization, how your current tools are working, and really think about what you want for the future and what you need to do to accomplish that. So the takeaway, 4 takeaway points. Number 1, land use patterns emerge whether planned or not. Number 2, spatial organization matters. It affects health, safety, and welfare. Number 3, plans and policies are great tools, but again, they must meet your needs, otherwise they're completely worthless. And number 4, tribes have a great opportunity if assets and attributes are well aligned with management activities. Oops, excuse me. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. And I truly hope that this session was interesting to you and helpful. I encourage you to ask questions afterwards. And I really hope that you'll stop by Renewal's virtual booth. Please feel free to contact me and by phone or email and talk about any of these concepts that we discussed today, and talk about how Renewal may be able to help you in your quest to make better conditions in the future and understand those spatial patterns and land use patterns and make more effective and productive use of lands. Visit our website and check us out on social media. Again, I really want to thank you for your time, and I hope that we can see each other next year in person. So be well and be safe. Thank you.